So good afternoon and welcome to our annual Fredeen Lecture. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, and I'm the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. Before we begin, I want to take this moment to acknowledge that the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives is located on Treaty 6 territory, and this is the traditional land of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and the Métis. Now, for me, one of the most important parts of acknowledging shared stewardship of this land, Treaty 6 peoples and the Métis, is to remind myself this is more than about the here and now. It's also about the past, our ancestors who got us to where we are today, for better or for worse, and the future, what we leave behind for those who come next. And reminding ourselves of this kind of intergenerational perspective and commitment. We might also be given to thinking about the importance of paying attention to those moments of transition when we as individuals pass from this life to whatever is next. And that is, in some sense, what today's talk's all about. It's about that, making that process as dignified and meaningful as it can be, so that these intergenerational bondings are rich with meaning and purpose. Now, on that note, I want to acknowledge the passing last week of Harold Chapman, a true cooperative genius who devoted his long life, he passed at 106, to making this world a better place. And, may we all find the strength, joy, and I understand mischievousness to live up to that vision. I also want to start by, excuse me, I lost my, before we hear from our speaker, I want to say a few words about this talk and the Fredeen Scholarship. This scholarship and this talk are in honor of Hartley and Margaret Fredeen and their long-standing commitment to cooperatives. The family was greatly influenced by growing up in a pioneering community where cooperation meant not only a way of life, but a necessary condition for life. And so the family want to honor that, but also Hartley and Margaret's close ties to the University of Saskatchewan. Both were graduates of the University of Saskatchewan, and were awarded the University of Saskatchewan's Alumni Award for Achievement in 1997. Since 2004, the Fredeen family has supported this scholarship so that graduate students at the University of Saskatchewan can pursue research on cooperatives. And in times of great division and challenges that demand more cooperation rather than less, I can think of no better legacy. So with that, I'd like to introduce and acknowledge Art Fredeen and Ken Fredeen. Ken, I see you're here as well. If you can just wave to the folks. Art's going to say a few words before I begin the formalities. So Art, over to you.
Yeah, you did a nice job there, actually, of summing these things up. But, just to have one of our parents still living is quite something. Mom is going to be 100 next year. Yeah, I think the way that we've managed this somehow, because our sister is the only one that lives in Saskatoon, and so we've been taking turns flying back to Saskatoon and helping out. I think that's a good example of sort of the cooperation that works so well, I think. And after a time of isolation too in COVID, I think this kind of cooperation and being, taking care of our loved ones is really critical. I don't have much else to say. I know Ken has been one of the bigger donors lately of the scholarship. So Ken, did you want to say, did you want to just follow up with a few things?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Art, and thanks everyone, and really looking forward to this presentation today. Cooperatives runs deep in the blood of the Fredeens in Saskatchewan on both sides of the family, and this scholarship really is about a recognition of the importance of cooperatives and the need for research in creating an alternative economy. So all of us have been successful in our lives. We support the University of Saskatchewan. This is an important scholarship to further research on the topic of cooperatives. And it's a real pleasure to be a part of this. And I look forward to it every year. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation today.
Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Art. And thank you to the broader Fredeen family for the continued support of our graduate students in their research and discovery of cooperatives. I think today's talk is going to be really engaging based on what I've seen so far, and I'm really looking forward to it. Just a few formalities before I introduce our speaker. we'd like to ask you to please remain on mute and turn off your camera for the duration of the presentation. You may, however, feel free to turn on your camera for the question and answer period of the event. If you have any questions during the talk or the Q&A part of our event, please submit them to me or Stan through the Zoom chat function. I'll call on you to unmute, or Stan will alert me that you want to be unmuted and want to ask a question. If you're having any technical difficulties, please message Stan Yu via Zoom. Stan, can you wave to people so they see you, just so they know?
Hi, everyone.
With a name, and Stan will communicate with you via the chat functions. So, gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, our speaker today, Sarah Firby. Sarah is the recipient of last year's Fredeen Scholarship. The way this works is people get, the scholarship, then they have a year to kind of prepare, and then they come and do a talk. So that's the kind of way it kind of works. So this is Sarah's talk. Sarah has a deep experience in the cooperative sector, and it began at a very young age. She was a youth participant in the Saskatchewan Cooperative Association's Camp Kindling, formerly known as the Co-op Camp. She later served as a youth program leader for Camp Kindling for 8 years. This camp has been a generator of many of the leaders in the cooperative sector in this province. And then she's continued to build on and grow her cooperative knowledge and skills during her post-secondary education. She is a recent graduate of the Graduate Certificate in Social Economy, Cooperatives and Nonprofit Sector program, which we have here at the Johnson Choyama Graduate School of Public Policy. She went on from there to get a Master's of Public Administration, also from our Public Policy School. And for the last 10 years, while she was doing that, she has worked for the cooperative retailing system here in Saskatoon. Now, along the way, she's also built this kind of an arsenal of awards. That's how I'm describing it. She's past recipient of the Co-operators, the insurance company's Young Leaders Award, the Leo and Bruce Thordarson Social Economy and Cooperatives Award, and now the Fredeen Award. Like Hartley and Margaret Fredeen, I believe Sarah believes in the potential of cooperatives to put members' interests rather than profit at the center of business, all grounded in democratic structure that help builds the tissue and sinew of an open and free society. Today's talk is perfectly aligned with that mindset, as Sarah is going to share with you findings from her studies into the growing presence and impact of funeral cooperatives in Canada. Now I'm going to say a little prayer, cross my fingers, and hope Sarah's presentation works. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Marc-Andre. And I also hope that everything comes clearly through audio-wise. We were having some issues prior, but I'm calling through my phone. So hopefully you can also see my screen and myself.
It's clear so far, Sarah. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Marc-Andre. I really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining today's call. Shockingly, in a world of banking and insurance and grocery stores, somehow funeral homes found a way to fit in the cooperative model. And part of that surprise really bumped my interest into studying funeral co-ops and their impact in Canada. And that's what the focus of our presentation here today is. So I think, well, we're maybe just loading the slide deck on the back end. That went through, hey, Stan? Awesome, perfect, thank you. Before I start my presentation though, I do want to send a large thank you to the Fredeen family, not only for your ongoing support of this scholarship program, but for carrying on the legacy of your parents, Margaret and Hartley. I did not have the pleasure of meeting Margaret or Hartley. I'm very pleased to hear that Margaret is still alive and that she is close to that milestone of 100. But learning about their strong involvement in Saskatchewan's growth in the cooperative movement and their immense concern for community has been nothing but inspiring and has really been, I guess, a testament to the support of local families in supporting that growth in Canada. What I didn't realize until earlier this week is Hartley actually was the chairman of the Memorial Society of Saskatchewan historically. So hopefully this, yeah, I had no idea up until this week. So hopefully some of this information, if he were alive today, would be of interest to him. And I'm pleased even that much more to present on this topic for that reason. I do also want to say a quick shout out to my friends and family, quite a few of which I think are on the call today listening in. But for your constant and consistent support throughout my studies and also pursuing topics like this. They've also listened to probably quite a bit about funeral homes over the last year. So hopefully this is, I guess, fruit of your investment listening to that. And then finally, I want to thank the Center for the Study of Co-operatives in Johnson Shoyama for the countless opportunities to learn and grow with them. And of course, to a couple of my professors who are on this call today. Next slide. Oh, next slide after that. Just a bit of background on myself, and I think Marc-Andre already did a really excellent job on giving background to my experience with Camp Kindling. Camp Kindling, formerly the Saskatchewan Cooperative Youth Program and formerly to that co-op schools, has actually been around for 95 years and has had, I think, over 40,000 attendees over the years. It is now a summer camp for youth ages 12 to 18. And was really the basis for my interest in the cooperative movement and a great entrance point into learning about that. As Marc-Andre had mentioned, I am employed with Federated Co-op in their energy department currently, but I've worked within the cooperative retailing system for about 10 years. And then starting around 2020, I was accepted into the graduate certificate in cooperatives and social economy program at Johnson Shoyama after my undergrad. COVID and 2020 was a great starting point for grad studies. But I was somehow a glutton for punishment and decided to go into the master's program just because I loved Johnson Shoyama so much and what they had to offer. So cooperatives have obviously played a huge part in my life. And I felt nothing but support from the cooperative community in a variety of ways for that reason. Next slide. So a bit on our agenda. So I'll go into why I've chosen, of all topics at 26 years old, to talk about funeral homes and why they're important today. I'll go over a brief outlook on the Canadian funeral industry and how the cooperative model is presented there. Then I'll talk a bit about the growth and impact of funeral co-ops, primarily in Quebec as a good case study for the movement, but then also in Ontario. How that connects to funeral co-ops in Western Canada and why we might not be seeing the same amount of growth as, say, in Quebec. And then just a brief discussion on the role of policy and culture in cooperative development. I do want to say before I get into this next slide, I do want to clarify that not all non-cooperative funeral homes are the quote-unquote boogeyman in the industry that are looking to prey on vulnerable customers. Unfortunately, it's typically a few bad eggs that do tarnish the industry perception for a lot of people, and cooperatives aren't necessarily always the saving grace in all situations, but they do provide an alternative in business operation, which I think is a good reason for cooperative development in other industries too. All right, so why funeral co-ops in 2023? Firstly, the conversation surrounding what is considered death care and funeral planning is heavily stigmatized in Western society. The industry carries the perception of predatory selling tactics through commission-based compensation plans and pricing towards vulnerable customers. And often these are lacking transparency in those pricing on what services are required to fulfill laying someone to rest versus what are nice additions in the memory of that individual. So reducing that stigma by having open conversations about death care connects well to the cooperative model's foundational intent in advocating towards placing more power in the hands of consumers. In the case specifically with the funeral industry, that is evident when customers seek out the best services for themselves, and also in alleviating pressure from loved ones in advocating for the preferences of those that they've lost, and in turn reducing the economic burden that may fall on family members when trying to, I guess, advocate for their lost loved ones. A couple of major events or factors that have maybe brought the conversation of death care and planning in conversation would be, of course, COVID-19. Unfortunately, COVID-19 highlighted worldwide a lot of flaws in the death care infrastructure, but also brought forward the reality of needing to have conversations when death is unplanned. Another factor to consider is that Canada has an aging population. So about 1/5 of our population is now 65 plus, where services like those found in the funeral industry will be of greater consideration over the next 10 to 20 years. I should also note, though, in the prairie provinces, somehow we have a greater population of 0 to 15, so might not be as much of a consideration here out in the prairies, but still a consideration nonetheless, and for the majority of our population, it is 65 plus. And finally, and not as great of a point, but in the wake of Bill C7, so medical assistance in dying, there's been greater realization that death can be more controllable, and having those conversations about what is considered a good death in society are more prevalent to the public. So how does the co-op model fit into the funeral industry? So cooperatives are largely formed with the focus on social equality and the ability to create capacity of participation for ostracized groups. So the International Cooperative Alliance, so ICA, outlines a couple foundational principles on member ownership, control, and benefit. Funeral homes are localized markets, primarily restricted by geographic location, often operating with an average radius of 16 to 24 kilometers. That is primarily due to the cost of transport of the deceased, and that cost associated with customers. This fits in well with the cooperative governance structure because it's largely centered around local community operation. Many cooperatives today are reliant on close networks of members to maintain operation and governance, though this is starting to evolve in the digital era in cooperative structures. Control over pricing is given back to members through democratic ownership, along with increased transparency in pricing through community board governance. Shockingly, but maybe not surprisingly to some, markups of products and services have been found to be upwards of 300% in some markets, due to the cost of things like caskets and urns. With the cooperative model, profits are returned back to members through the model, decreasing incentive for businesses to price gouge on products and services like caskets and urns. I should note that funeral co-ops are still able to use commission-based selling tactics when offering services, but that can be, I believe, determined by their bylaws within the cooperative. So again, more control passed back to the community. I would also argue the inclusion of cooperative bylaws through that local governance adds a layer of accountability for the business to operate in the customer's best interests above and beyond perhaps industry standards, legislative safeguards, and operational policies. And thirdly, conversation disruption. So I truly believe the funeral industry is a great case study to explain the cooperative model and its evolution to the public, in addition to being an industry that touches us all, unfortunately, at some point in our life. A bit of a stretch in terms of argument, but I would also argue that the funeral industry disrupts the conversation surrounding the co-op model and what it has to offer, using that stigma and perhaps even shock value of the industry as an advantage for communities to ask deeper questions about the cooperative model as a viable business alternative. Whether or not that comes down to ownership of the business itself by the people that use it, or by other ownership means for already established funeral businesses, which we'll talk about later in this discussion. So with all these great reasons in mind, when I looked at, sorry, Sam, if you jump back to the previous slide. So unfortunately, with all these great reasons that I've initially identified, when I looked at Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada and their map of cooperatives across the country, if you look at this picture, we see a really good presence of funeral co-ops in Eastern Canada, but very few out west. And so this got me considering, okay, well, why, if this is what I consider a great fit for the co-op model, are we not seeing more cooperative presence in the funeral industry compared to, say, Quebec or Ontario? So that was really the basis and the question that sparked the research topic that I chose here today. And I'll get into hopefully some rationale later in my presentation for that reason. All right, next slide. Awesome, thank you. So just a quick discussion about the Canadian funeral industry at a glance. So this industry is about $1.7 billion, and through consolidation and vertical integration, we are seeing that more large multinational companies, especially from the United States, are coming in and acquiring what are considered small, local, mom and pop businesses that have historically been operational in the funeral industry in this country. Despite this, it is an industry that has fairly low competition. There has been a slight industry decline of 4.1% on average between 2017 and 2022. But with this in consideration, we still have, as I mentioned before, that aging population, which is about 7 million Canadians over the age of 65. Next slide. So how is the cooperative model presented in the funeral industry? So most commonly, we see that funeral co-ops are consumer co-ops, much like your local grocery or fuel store, where the business is owned and operated by the people who use them. So if you were an individual seeking out funeral services for yourself or even a family member, you would have partial ownership and one vote in that business. The second example, and I believe that Calgary Cooperative Memorial Society might be on this call, are memorial societies. So they're more common in Western Canada than out east, but they're typically nonprofits that do not sell goods to the members like the grocery stores we see out west here. So they don't sell the funeral services, but they assist members with funeral planning and provide access to those services offered by regular local funeral parlors and cemeteries at reduced rates. And perhaps even rates negotiated for members by the society. But again, still cooperative, and they are governed by a board of directors and still have membership voting. The third example is second-tier cooperatives. So very similar to federated co-op that I work for, in that they are owned by cooperatives, existing cooperative businesses, and cooperatively owned by those businesses. A great example of this, which I'll talk about further on in my presentation, is the Fédération des coopératives funéraires du Québec. My French is terrible, so that pronunciation was probably equally as terrible. But they are a really good example and a shining example of the role that unity can have in the cooperative movement. And finally, not common in Canada, but more so the United States, are cooperatives that are owned by independent funeral homes. So multiple funeral homes may cooperatively own high-cost funeral service inputs like crematoriums. Worker co-ops are pretty uncommon, but I do have a slide at the end where we could maybe have a discussion about why that might be the case, considering a lot of small local businesses are starting to be acquired or have been acquired by larger multinationals from the States. All right, next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to take a lot of time in particular on this slide talking about Quebec, because they are, I think, the leader in funeral co-ops in Canada. And I want to talk about the history of how that came to be, and how that has impacted perception of co-ops in the funeral industry in that province, and then also other provinces out east. So looking back between 1830 and 1930, social and religious intention was baked into the culture of Quebec, and subsequently the origins of the cooperative model in the province through the support of the Catholic Church. Clergy saw the need to actively participate in the improvement of material conditions of workers in both urban and rural areas, where cooperatives were seen as maybe a solution favoring the economy, but also moral recovery. And I'd really like to highlight a great paper done by the University of Laval for this analysis, because it's pretty in-depth on the culture and the impact that has had historically over the previous 100 years. But jumping back, again, a solution favoring economic and moral recovery with a means to support agricultural progress. So still agricultural roots similar to Western Canada. And this sparked the movement of Ces Populaires and Desjardins, which later expanded in the 1960s to the funeral industry that we know today. So between 1960 and 1980, Quebec experienced what was called a quiet revolution, with impacts on pricing with the rise of funeral homes. So the quiet revolution was driven through national affirmation, and the Quebec public system took on a role across social and those economic activities by replacing those previously mentioned religious institutions in primarily the health and education sectors. And that resulted in crown corporations that participated in more economic development, which impacted laws and regulations and standards of governance, where plans were made to expand cooperatives in structured sectors like agriculture and new sectors like funeral homes, the funeral industry. From this quiet revolution, we saw pretty drastic changes in funeral costs to consumers. The average cost per death was 20% higher in Quebec in 1972 than the rest of Canada, but by 1993, the average funeral cost 13% less in Quebec than in Canada. And users paid on average about 43% less than Quebecers as a whole. So pretty drastic impact on the market through that cooperative development. But as Barros, through the University of Laval, argues, this was primarily due to the individual funeral co-ops, not through the united approach through the federation that was later developed. So, since 1995, the acquisition of private funeral enterprises has been the cornerstone of cooperative development and the strategy in Quebec for dealing, as I mentioned before, the arrival of foreign multinationals, especially in areas like the Lower St. Lawrence and Upper North Shore. The establishment, jumping to the individual establishments versus united approach, the establishment of those 19 funeral co-ops around the 1970s undermined private funeral companies in several areas of Quebec, as I mentioned before, breaking a lot of monopolies that lasted for generations in the industry. It could be considered a victory against that maldistribution in the funeral industry, but it was primarily, as I mentioned before, that consequence of those individual funeral co-ops joining forces and also their individual work. Later on, that cost sharing, when it came to sourcing materials and through wholesale of caskets and urns, that was a secondary result through that united approach that was experienced through the Federation. Looking at some political, social, and economic remedies and how they influence change in the funeral industry. The Quebec Funeral Committee at the time prior to the Federation signed an agreement with an insurance company and created a specific life insurance program for co-op members who could then subscribe by registering their funeral co-op as a beneficiary. The co-op would then receive money for the funeral service, and in addition, the insurance company gave the committee a small dividend from each insurance policy that was sold. And in 1993 is when the Federation saw a primary revival through a second movement and the development of a framework for the actual funeral institution, which was more conscious to unify the power of those individual funeral homes that were developed in the 20 years prior. So a few key impacts that were felt through this impact and through this unification were the development of a consistent movement image. So one might say the brand standards of the funeral co-op business in Quebec, information flow among members and customers on funeral services and sourcing products, and the creation of those buying groups that help to reduce the cost for cooperative funeral homes in the sector. Another inequality facing funeral co-ops at the time was also in the political arena, which I think will lend well to the discussion later on in this presentation. But there was a general perception among funeral co-ops that the political discussion on death care was limited to a small elite of state officials and multinational corporations from the states, making market discourses and decisions that were privileged information away from the cooperative movement. Essentially, that co-ops did not have a seat at the table when it came to those political discussions. The Federation's general manager at the time actually commissioned a comprehensive study on Quebec funeral homes to plan political representation in various provincial networks, so municipal and then also provincial government, with a focus on the Americans' arrival as risky to consumers in the Quebec territory, and using that study with political leaders to engage in conversation. So in addition to that study, the Cooperative Federation emancipated itself from the Corporation of Thanatologists, which apparently is the study of death care. Who knew? When funeral co-ops began advertising on the basis of price, that sent a rift into the relationship between that organization and the Federation. And lastly, the Federation started to build strategic political alliances with key members in the local parliament. So a lot of very intensive work throughout the last 30 years, especially by the Federation when it comes to funeral co-op development. And that's played a key role in the success and the reliability of the cooperative movement for the funeral industry since. Moving on to Ontario and their impact. So a very interesting case study in comparison to Quebec. But despite having the largest population in Canada and being one border away, Quebec has 32 funeral co-op homes, but Ontario has only 6. They have the highest concentration of population and number of funeral establishments, so around 600 plus. But again, only 6 of those are funeral co-ops in comparison. They have a lot of, I guess, funeral homes in Ontario have strong ties to the Quebec Federation that I described earlier. And in 2006, there were discussions about the creation of a Canadian Association of Funeral Homes. But a lot of funeral co-ops in Ontario ended up moving towards the Quebec Federation for support as an alternative. Next slide. Perfect. Thank you. This is a brief snapshot on Western Canada's funeral industry as it stands. So we do have quite a few funeral homes in Western Canada, but as you can see by that second row, we are particularly lagging in funeral co-ops. The funeral co-ops that do exist are consumer co-ops, but we do have, I believe, 1 or 2 memorial societies, like Calgary Cooperative Memorial Society, that are operating. But again, still a very small presence. And as you can see, the cost of funerals in Western Canada ranges by province, but again, are pretty substantial per person, but they can also range based on preferences. The governance structure of the funeral industry in Western Canada is interesting in that there is a connection between provincial policy, but then also consumer protection organizations that impact how co-ops can potentially operate in the funeral space. Right, I'll pass off to the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, a few cooperative considerations in Western Canada. For those who are on the call who are maybe not familiar with cooperative policy and how cooperatives are governed, there are provincial cooperative legislation, cooperative acts that cooperatives across this country follow, again, individually for each province, but they also follow the standards and legislation set out by the Canadian Cooperative Act. So in addition to following legislation by cooperative policy, funeral co-ops also have to maintain standards and legislation with individual provincial policy boards, consumer protection acts. As I mentioned before, there are about 5 funeral co-ops in Western Canada. Again, very small population compared to out east. And this is due, what I believe, to a number of reasons, a number of culture and policy influences in Western Canada. Firstly is global market restructuring. So in the 1980s, global market restructuring, globalization, and neoliberal policy reform created a lot of instability for Canadian cooperatives, primarily requiring adjustments to a very changing, altering competitive and regulatory landscape. However, as we saw earlier, and as I'll show in the next slide after, in Quebec, primarily, there was a cooperative presence that nearly doubled over 2 decades compared to provinces like Saskatchewan. This is largely due to what are considered the historical blocks of the provinces or areas. So agrarian agriculture was, one might argue, or studies argue, was eroding at the time in Western Canada, but urbanized and expanding historical blocks in Quebec brought on the Quiet Revolution and societal remedies, as I discussed earlier. Furthermore, to that shift in agricultural cooperative presence in Western Canada. So in 2001, companies like Agricor were the result of a merger between the Alberta Wheat Pool and the Manitoba Pool Elevators in 1998. Those merged with United Grain Growers UGG to form Agricor United. It's getting very confusing. And then AU was then acquired by the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool in 2007. And that amalgamated company was then known as Viterra. Again, very confusing, but a very large shift in agricultural presence from cooperative to differing companies, different business structures, had an immense impact on cooperative culture and policy in Western Canada. And on the next slide, this is a very telling example. As you can see in this table, throughout the 20 years, a lot of research done by Murray Fulton and his group, there are a large drop in cooperatives and their market share in many industries like dairy, poultry, eggs, grain, oilseed sectors in Western Canada, but in Eastern Canada, we still saw a large retention of cooperative presence in Quebec and Ontario. So during the 90s, again, and early 2000s in Saskatchewan, as an example, though arguable again for the rest of Western Canada, that global restructuring also drove a reduction in cooperative spending, with credit and agricultural production and the marketing towards those industries slowing down, as a lot of multinational competitors like Walmart had greater market impact and economies of scale with the size of their businesses. You could liken it to putting on someone's oxygen mask, or you could liken, I guess, the situation with the lack of rebuilding the movement towards a greater social base and the maintenance of the cooperatives in those areas, those narrowed down areas. Consider it as putting your oxygen mask on a plane crash towards yourself rather than to your neighbor, and focusing on the retention of one's own business rather than pushing forward the movement in other social areas like the funeral industry. Very convoluted way to put that, but that impact culturally with the decrease in the cooperative movement on the agricultural side did deter from growth in the social movements of other industries like the funeral industry. And finally, the last policy consideration I'll talk about is that cooperatives do not have a strong seat at the table in many industries and governing bodies like Consumer Protection BC. And I also wouldn't be surprised if cooperatives were not discussed during formal personal training in the funeral industry, like mortuary school. I won't get into too much when it comes to the policy space. I would defer the pursuit of policy reform in that discussion to last year's recipient of the Fredeen Scholarship, Bill Omachon. And I'm not sure if he's on the call, but I would be interested in his perspective on policy development. But linking back to that example of 2006 and the Canadian Association consideration for federation with funeral homes, I would also argue that geographic proximity also plays a large role in the lack of further development of the cooperative funeral industry in Western Canada. Jump to the next slide. And then this is just another great example of data, again, from the last 30 or 40 years of the impact of culture and policy in the growth of co-op associations, the membership growth, and then also in asset growth between, say, Saskatchewan and Quebec. Right, next slide. All right, so the role of policy and culture in cooperative growth. So referencing back to a great talk performed by Stan and the Center for the Study of Co-operatives earlier this year, there is a study that is conducted with top co-ops across Canada, I believe, called Top Issues. And for the 5th year in a row, improving awareness about the relevance and the cooperative model has been the #1 issue. To that point, when it comes to policy and culture, it is difficult and requires a united approach to business development as showcased through Quebec and the funeral industry in order to address community issues and needs. Another great example of this would be in regards to housing and the need for affordable housing in BC and Ontario, and the role that a united approach takes with the cooperative movement in order to address societal needs of that nature. When it comes to policy development, and creating lasting impact, it does take a united approach to engage with policy leaders and have that seat at the table. And it really comes down to how we start the conversation among the public, not only when it comes to retention of existing cooperatives in the movement, but then how we look into the conversation about niche industries like the funeral industry and cooperative growth in Western Canada. Another great question to ask is how we create cooperation among cooperatives. So referencing Cooperative Principle 6 in a diversely regulated industry. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the funeral industry itself is diverse in that it requires focus on provincial policy in the cooperative movement, but then also provincial policy in the funerary space. So a united approach is required to ensure that policy and culture is consistent across all industries. Next slide. So in conclusion, the funeral industry, I believe, is a great case study into the role of the cooperative movement in impacting the economy of our provinces. But it is symptomatic of a larger focus and larger forces at play within our societies, especially in Western Canada, and the impact that agricultural decline in the cooperative space earlier in the 2000s and 90s had provided and impacted in other industries. There is a large presence of private organizations through acquisitions that are placing risk on cooperative growth in the funeral space. And local knowledge of the cooperative model is impactful in preserving the culture of cooperative focus in Western Canada. And I'll maybe wrap it up there. Thank you so much, and I'll open the floor to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. We actually have a question in chat. That was great. I want to make sure that the Fredeens have a chance at a question before we wrap up, and then I do have a question in chat that I'm going to pass along. So, Ken or Art, do you have a, not to put you too much on the spot, but do you have a question for Sarah about what you just heard?
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Sarah. First of all, thanks very much. So thorough. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious about the, given the model, we're dealing with people who are dying. How does the actual structure work in terms of who owns the cooperative share? Is it a family-owned share, or is it an individual, or how does that work? Just the mechanics of it.
So with consumer co-ops on the funeral side of things, so if you were seeking out funeral services for yourself, you could purchase a share. I think it ranges for each co-op association, but I've seen shares at around $40. And with that, you really wouldn't see the benefits of that share other than ownership, unless you were to pass. And that includes reduced pricing, I think, for a good portion of co-ops that I have looked at, reduced pricing up to 15% in some. But then you can also purchase shares on behalf of other family members. In terms of what that ownership voting looks like, I'm not too sure when purchased for others, but for yourself, you would have voting rights in terms of pricing, and then also likely board election if you would like to pursue that route.
And just to comment, Sarah, you identified it early on in your presentation that our father was hugely supportive of the Memorial Society, and he was almost evangelical about the fact that people are getting ripped off by funeral homes, and this was the way to address that. And his funeral was a Memorial Society. It was awesome. So so thanks for identifying that, because that's something that he always felt was important. Art?
Great to hear.
Art, did you have a quick question?
No, I don't really.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Sarah. Really appreciated the work that you put into this this presentation and this work that you've done. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Sarah, we do have a question here, and it was kind of related to the themes that you were addressing near the end of your talk. And I'll just read it verbatim, and you can go for it. When you evaluate the Western Canadian landscape of funeral co-ops, what did you observe as one of the two biggest barriers to the growth of that sector, of the funeral co-op sector?
Very good question. So not to cop out to the survey that is conducted by the Center for the Study of Co-operatives, but definitely awareness of co-ops as a viable business alternative. Again, we see co-ops very present in the grocery space, the fuel space, agriculture, credit unions even, but the awareness that it is at a grassroots level available as a business structure for other means, I think that is also a barrier there. And it's very difficult, which I think Cooperatives First is doing great work in terms of reducing that strain, but it is very difficult to start a business from a community perspective when people aren't fully on board and want to, I guess, start businesses that don't necessarily have a great profit individually, but do create a lot of social change. Daycares are a great example of that, housing cooperatives, and I think the funeral space fits well into that grassroots priority.
So a related question, Sarah, what would be the first steps for funeral homes in moving towards the cooperative model? Like if you had an existing funeral home, maybe the family or the business owners are thinking of getting out and want to retire. How would that happen, or could it happen?
I know that we're running short on time, but I think worker co-ops are an area of study and an area of funeral home or funeral industry involvement where we don't see a lot of presence, but I think there is a lot of potential there. With memorial societies, I think that is opportunity for existing funeral homes to have an enter space into the cooperative movement while still maintaining their operations. I'll also say that reach out to cooperatives first. They have a lot of great resources in terms of cooperative development, especially at that grassroots level. So I would also recommend reaching out to them. But I think it starts with having the conversation on longevity within the businesses that you already have at the funeral level.
Thank you, Sarah. I can't help but wonder if it might be also useful to reach out to the Federation in Quebec, right? They've already helped people in Ontario. They know how this thing works. Might be worth taking a snap there. So look, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, and to that point, there was some work done, I believe, in the 2000s by the Federation, reaching out to Saskatchewan about cooperative development. But again, just hadn't taken off, obviously, since then. And the number of funeral co-ops, I think, has declined in Saskatchewan, at least in the last 20 years.
Right. Okay. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for a really, really interesting talk, and gives us lots of food for thought for going forward. Before everyone scoots off for the rest of the day, a few quick announcements. It's my great pleasure to announce that the 2023 scholarship winner of the Fredeen Scholarship is Aylin Jorge Cotto. And Aylin is currently a Master's of Public Policy student at Johnson Stroyama Graduate School of Public Policy. And she's also a student assistant or research assistant for the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives, as well as the Canadian Association for Studies in Cooperation. Her keen interest in cooperatives began during her Master's of Industrial Engineering at the National Polytechnical Institute of Mexico, where a research opportunity opened her eyes to the worlds of cooperatives. And I can say I know Aylin well. She has a very meticulous, thoughtful mind. You're going to enjoy her talk next year. She's going to be looking at this kind of intersection, sometimes fraught, between cooperatives and government. And I think Sarah's talk today kind of hit on that theme, and this is where the big bullseye is for Aylin. So that's next year. Wait for it, next year. I want to draw your attention to two more upcoming talks in the near term. Our annual McPherson talk will take place on December 4th from 4:30 to 5:30, and we're going to be featuring Dr. Maurice Altman, who used to be at the University of Saskatchewan in the economics department. Now he's at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and he's going to talk to us about democratic organizations as the engine of equitable growth. So a consistent theme, I think, with what we just heard today. Third and finally, our next co-op conversations, which are monthly conversations with people in the cooperative sector on the first Wednesday of every month, will be featuring Doctors Daphne Rickson and Fiona Duguid from St. Mary's University, and they're going to share some results from their recent research to develop specific indicators for cooperatives to measure their performance on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Stan's going to post a registration link to that talk in the chat. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today for the 2023 Fredeen Lecture. We hope to see you at our future talks. Have a great rest of your day.